Father Michael Orsi. I am your host for Action for Life Television, that good news program which brings you the good news of Jesus Christ, that big G for the gospel, and the little g, all the good things that people do to put the gospel of life into action. Today, we have somebody who's very, very connected not only in this country, Washington, D.C., but also at the United Nations. And our guest, her name is Rebecca Ose, and she is Director of Research for the Center for Family and Human Rights. Center for Family and Human Rights, also known as Cfam. So I am extremely delighted to have her here today because she's going to talk about some of the things going on in Washington, which, tell you the truth, I don't even want to hear about it myself, and a lot of the things that are going on at the United Nations because, well, sometimes the United Nations does not do exactly the right thing by women and children, although they purport to be great defenders of women and children and the family. Of course, you have to know what they mean by family, so we're going to discuss that too. Is that true, what I've said about what's going on in the United Nations and in Washington?
Yes, that's absolutely right.
Oh, I hit it right on the head. Okay. Now,
Yes.
Let's begin talking to us about what is Cfam.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your show. This is a great pleasure. So Cfam has been working at the UN and also in Washington, D.C. for over 20 years now. And our focus is defending human life and the family at the level of international institutions, and also focusing on what the U.S. government is doing in its work with international institutions. So we are an American-based organization, and so we work as a member of civil society at the UN, but also we try and work with people in our government who are like-minded to encourage them to do the right thing. My organization was founded after some very large global conferences in the 1990s. There was one in 1994 in Cairo, Egypt, called the International Conference on Population and Development, or ICPD. And there was a concerted effort to try and establish an international human right to abortion at that conference. And there was a call that went out from our beloved Saint Pope John Paul II calling for people of goodwill to come and get involved in this fight. And so a lot of great pro-life people came to that meeting and worked with countries that wanted to defend life. And so the attempt to create such a right to abortion at the UN was blocked.
But really,
but of course, the fight continues.
That was like a long time ago. What year was that?
1994.
94. That's a long time ago. I think I was just an infant in 1994. You believe that? All right. I hope you do. All
yes,
right.
Yes, I was only in high school.
You mean you're older than me? Anyway, things have changed. You talked about, countries that were, against a right, internationally recognized UN right to abortion. Now, at that time, you had more support, I'm sure. The world has changed quite a bit. I mean, the UN has really done a terrible disservice to the rights of women, especially baby women and families. So what's happened over this time?
So that's a really great question. So the good news is that there is still not an international human right to abortion, that has never happened. There has been an ongoing fight in the 25 years or so since then, certainly, and the fight continues. But so far, we are still holding the line. We are still winning. I think one of the biggest changes that has happened, when you think about the UN, right? I mean, it's this huge organization that involves all the countries of the world coming together and having conversations. And, there's the General Assembly where all the world leaders come, and deliver their statements. But there's also an enormous bureaucracy at the UN. There's the Secretariat, there's all the different agencies, the World Health Organization, the United Nations Population Fund. And these groups are a lot less accountable. And while they are supposed to get their mandate from what the member states or the nations of the world tell them, we've noticed that they have increasingly exceeded their mandates and gone beyond what the nations are telling them to do. And they are certainly pressuring countries to liberalize their abortion laws.
Well, I want to ask you, Rebecca, our own country, under the present administration, must be pushing for greater abortion rights worldwide.
Yes, unfortunately, this has been a problem with Democratic administrations. The Clinton administration back in the 1990s were among those pushing for a right to abortion then. And, we see this go back and forth depending on who's in the White House. And so that, is a fight that goes on in this country as well. The good news is that we have in law some very important restrictions on funding for abortion overseas. So the most important one is the Helms Amendment to the Foreign Appropriations Law. And this has been in place since 1973, which of course is the same year that Roe versus Wade, of course,
So
was
this
decided.
came about because of Senator Jesse Helms? Is that who it's named after?
That is correct, yes.
Okay,
yes.
and the Helms Amendment, yes,
Yes.
says what?
So it is attached to the Foreign Appropriations Law. So basically what it says is that money that is appropriated cannot go to fund or promote abortion overseas.
Appropriated to the UN?
Not to
Or
the
to
UN
any-
specifically, but anything that's in that Foreign Appropriations Law. So it's not a law that's a standalone law. It's a rider on that law.
Okay, so they cannot receive federal money for abortions, according
That is
to the
correct. It cannot
Helms.
go, federal US funding overseas cannot fund abortions directly or the promotion of abortion in foreign countries. Now, the problem, of course, is that groups like the International Planned Parenthood Federation or Marie Stopes International and these other, abortion giants, what they would
Folks,
do
I
is
want
they
to
would
just stop for one moment. Marie Stopes is the Planned Parenthood of Great Britain.
In fact, I mean, they have Planned Parenthood there too. It's another organization that was founded around the same time that also has, some history in the eugenics movement. Hence, they've changed their name
Marie
now to
Stopes was as
MSI.
charming as Margaret Singer, I suppose. Very
Yes,
charming, yes. Well, I think they were cousins. I'm sorry, go ahead.
They were at least similar ideologically. But, groups like that, foreign-based organizations that promote and provide abortions overseas, they were still able to receive US funding as long as it wasn't directly going to those programs, to those parts of their work. And
Well- But isn't this the same kind of a deal we have when they say we're funding Planned Parenthood, but the money is not going toward abortions?
well, that is the problem, right? Money is fungible. And how money moves around inside of an organization, we know that if you fund these organizations, if they don't use those specific funds, they'll use other funds to promote abortion because that's what they do. And so this is why the Mexico City policy is so important. So the Helms Amendment says that money from the US does not go to provide or promote abortion overseas, but the Mexico City policy says that if you are a group that is based overseas that does those things, that promotes or provides abortion, you are not eligible for US funding. But the difference is that the Mexico City policy is an executive order, not a law. And so Republican presidents since Ronald Reagan have instituted the Mexico City policy, but then it gets rescinded every time a Democrat comes back into office. And so under former President Trump, it was expanded, in fact. Not only does it cover the family planning funding from the US government, but all global health, which was very important because, as you probably know, the abortion issue has kind of grown and metastasized all throughout global health. And so that was a great thing, and it did a lot of good. Unfortunately, it has been now rescinded under President Biden.
So you have the Helms Amendment, which says you can't. Then you have an executive order that says you can.
Well, no, the executive order doesn't override the Helms Amendment. So
Well, how
US
does it
funding
work?
is still not allowed to.
Well,
Right.
Well, okay. Well, tell us how that works. So that if one president says you can, and the other one says you can't, well, when you can, what happens?
So basically what it means is that organizations like the International Planned Parenthood Federation are now eligible to receive US funding, just not for their abortion work.
Oh, the same old weasel deal, yeah.
Yes.
All right, okay. You see, folks, This is what we call weasel legislation. Oh, of course, the money is not going toward abortions. It's just going to help Planned Parenthood supply other services for women. And of course, you know, that frees up a lot of extra money to do their other nefarious deeds. Now, let's get to these other nefarious deeds, okay? All right. So Planned Parenthood, Maurice Stopes, her cousin to Margaret Sanger, they don't just do abortions, but you have concerns too about LGBTQ+, and they're getting monies to Planned Parenthood and other organizations that are detrimental to human well-being. Although, if you ask them, this is kind of the best thing in the whole world that could happen to somebody who's kind of mixed up and don't know if there's a boy or a girl and wants to change to become some. I'm sorry, folks, I can't take it anymore. Father O is getting old. I get agitated. But I mean, think of this. Rebecca, I'm sorry. Please help me. Help me understand what's going on and how the UN gets involved in this.
Sure. Well, I'll make one quick point first about some of these organizations like Planned Parenthood International. You're absolutely right. They are moving more and more into the transgender space, providing, you know, these hormones and other treatments for people who want to change, you know, their sex. And so this is obviously a problem that's taking place overseas as well as in our country. The thing about some of these organizations, you know, as you were saying, you know, the money is fungible. It can go from one thing to another. And when the United States government funds these groups at all, it gives them a greater presence. It gives them credibility in countries. They will then go into capitals. They will talk to politicians. They will lobby, and they will promote all of the things that we stand against, you know, as Catholics and as people of goodwill. And so, you know, when U.S. aid is delivered in foreign countries, it has it written right there on the box, from the American people. And so as you know, it used to be
we deliver food and first aid, and people are grateful for food and first aid. Now what are you delivering? Oh, we're delivering some equipment for abortion. Yay! We're delivering some hormone shots for some kid that's mixed up. I don't get it. I don't get it. Please help me and help the audience to understand this.
Well, you know, it's really an ideological battle that's going on at all different levels, both, you know, in terms of how we as a country give aid on the ground, but also in terms of what happens at the UN. You know, there's a lot of topics that are extremely controversial in these international negotiations, right? So there's negotiations going on right now. They have the annual Commission on the Status of Women, which is a 2-week-long conference. It's done mostly remotely this year. But the goal of this conference is there's a whole lot of different events going on. But at the end, they're going to try and have a negotiated outcome document agreed by all the member states.
Negotiated outcome document. Tell us what that is and what this document, what they want it to be.
Sure. So when the UN negotiates on a document, the idea is that they want to have it adopted by consensus, which means that all of the countries are able to agree to it, that nobody objects. If someone calls for a vote and they have to vote on the document, then that has less weight than if it were adopted by consensus. And so there's a process that goes on where people suggest different language, you know, they'll call for the deletion of language, and the back and forth happens every time. And of course, one of the most contentious, you know, is this Commission on the Status of Women, because of course, all these issues, you know, related to gender, related to the family, related to abortion, all are always present. And so there is language that they want to promote involving terms like sexual and reproductive health, reproductive rights, various forms of the family.
And that means like reproductive rights means abortion, right?
Well, it's interesting because that language first actually entered the UN. Abortion language really entered the UN back in 1994 at that conference I was telling you about, where abortion as a right was blocked. The language on sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights was in that outcome document that was negotiated then. But there were important caveats that were also included. It said that, for one thing, the laws on whether abortion is legal and under what circumstances are for individual countries to determine, not the UN. That abortion should never, ever be promoted as a method of family planning, that governments need to provide women with alternatives. So, obviously, as pro-life Catholics, we would never want abortion to be done, regardless of its legality. We would want protections of the unborn to be, the standard. But as a compromise, it has held for 25 years that at the very least, it is for countries, for sovereign nations to determine the legality or not of abortion and what restrictions are on it. Unfortunately, of course, a lot of UN agencies and others are pressuring countries that they should change their laws regardless.
Okay. Now, we talked about abortion. We talked a little bit about the transgender movement being promoted at the UN. Give us a little insight into that. What's going on with that?
Sure. Well, it's obviously very controversial. In many countries, this is something that they will push back on very, very hard when it's suggested for inclusion in a document. I think a lot of the difficulty with these UN negotiations is that there's so much euphemism, so many terms that, how are they defined? Everyone can say, well, it means something different. And so this is how sometimes you get to consensus, is that everyone can go back to their capitals and say, this term is okay, or this term includes this, or it doesn't include this. And so certainly one of the issues that has come up in recent years, there's one of the foundational documents of the UN is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, from, back when the UN was founded.
But that was pretty nice. I mean, I read it numerous times. That was a very nice document.
Yes, and it includes a clause that says that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society, and that it is, eligible for protection, entitled to protection by the state. Now, the notion of the family as natural and fundamental has recently become controversial at the UN when nations have called for language on the family that is consistent with that document to be included in their negotiations. Some countries are even pushing back.
As you can imagine, producing this wonderful program, Action for Life, it costs a great deal of money. We're going to need your help. So if you would like to donate to keep this good news program on the air, please go to your computer, your cell phone, actionforlife.net. Our thought for the day: I hope that all of you have Bibles in your home. The Bible is the Word of God, and there's nothing more powerful than God's Word. Keep it in a prominent place to remind you that you are part of God's good news and that God is using you to do His will. They're trying to redesign the family. Even, what constitutes family is being tampered with. And we know that the family is the basic building block of society. And so, they're going toward a new world order. I mean, that's how I see this. But continue on. Okay, so they want to redesign the family now. Some places. I'm sure not the Muslim countries, I'm sure, or the African countries, I'm sure.
Right. I mean, certainly there are countries that are more conservative that are pushing back very hard on this. But part of the problem is that certainly the European Union as a whole has been pushing very hard for more, as they would say, progressive language in these outcomes. And, the unfortunate truth is that the wealthier countries of the world are doing a lot of the worst things in these environments. And they have a lot of clout because they both provide a lot of bilateral aid to other countries. And they also are the ones who, for the most part, are funding the UN system and all of its various bureaucracies and agencies. And so they have a lot of ways of exerting pressure on the rest of the world. And it's often the poorer countries and the smaller countries that are really having to push back.
Okay, so when we talk about the redesigning of the family, well, what's their vision? Anything goes, whatever you want?
Basically, yes. I mean,
See, folks, I'm a genius. I got right to the heart of the matter here. I mean, whatever you want to be family, okay? Talk some more about it.
Well, obviously this is an inroad for issues of sexual orientation and gender identity.
What's that term you gave me? We talked earlier today. SOGI. SOGI.
Yes.
Tell them what SOGI is.
Well, that is the acronym for sexual orientation and gender identity. And that is the terminology that you most often hear at the UN, probably because the LGBTQIA acronym has just gotten so long and unwieldy that no one can remember.
What is that one? I can't keep up with this. IA now, too. What's that?
I believe I is intersex, and that refers to people who are born with slightly ambiguous characteristics because of, some sort of developmental process going awry. And A, I believe, is asexual. There's an ever-expanding panoply of terms now being included.
I'm not even being funny. I just can't believe it. Maybe I just don't get it. I just don't. Maybe. So you want to redesign the family. You have every variety of sexuality in the whole world. The rich countries are pushing this agenda, and I got to ask you, why?
Well, that's a really great question. I think, one reason perhaps that it's the richer countries that are promoting the sexual revolution, as it were, is because you kind of have to be a rich country to not be devastated by the effects of that. When we unmoor sexuality from, a basic understanding of the human person and the human family, there is a cost. And it is a cost that has, mental health, physical health, certainly the well-being of children. And, if you're a poor country that doesn't have strong social services, if you don't have, access to good healthcare, clean water, et cetera, these things can be a matter of life and death. Whereas if you are a wealthy, developed country, you can at least to some extent, obviously not entirely, but you can to some extent buy off or delay the consequences.
So look, this is like happening like right now at the UN, but it's also happening in our own country where this agenda is being promoted. So what I hear you saying, though, and this is leading to disaster.
Yes, although there are certainly people who are speaking out, and there's definitely still a fight going on. So it's not a time to give up.
Okay, so Cfam is in the forefront of the battle.
We are part of a coalition of pro-life and pro-family organizations that are at the UN and working with delegates from countries that are like-minded as well.
Okay, now you go to these meetings. They call them NGOs. And yes? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes, non-governmental organizations.
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. So you go to these meetings and everybody is talking about whatever, okay, the family and abortion or women's rights or whatever the case may be. They don't say abortion, though, do they? They don't say that.
Well, they will in certain settings. Getting language on abortion directly into a document would be a heavy lift, I think, even for the Europeans to get through. But, obviously the euphemistic language on sexual and reproductive health is where a lot of the mischief is.
So you sit there at these meetings, and how many people are, hey, there's a sign goes up, there's a meeting today about reproductive rights, and you attend?
We will certainly attend. I mean, obviously a lot of things are virtual right now, but there are different types of meetings, right? I mean, there are meetings where statements are delivered and people are just essentially, each delivering their statement. There are also closed room negotiations that are only attended by delegates of countries where they are negotiating a text for adoption. And so it really depends. There are spaces that civil society or NGOs can have access to and others that are more behind the scenes.
So then it leaves one of these meetings, these committee meetings or NGO meetings, and then it goes to the next level. The delegates from the different nations take it to the floor of the UN?
Well, certainly we have the ability to talk to delegates and to share information that they might find useful. Mm-hmm. So, certainly there's a lot of discussion that goes on. Right now during the Commission on the Status of Women, under more normal times, there would be thousands and thousands of people from around the world, women's rights activists and various groups that would, as well as delegations from capitals around the world that would all be convening on New York, and a lot of different events would be happening and a lot of opportunities to talk to people. Well, I think, certainly the biggest success is the fact that despite so many thousands, millions of dollars being spent and so many years of effort, there is not an international human right to abortion. The opposition is, I would say, less well-funded at a minimum, certainly pushing an uphill battle.
Something is better than nothing, and you continue in the battle. And that's a great thing. Now, we have only a little bit of time left. I want to ask you very briefly, how is the present administration in Washington affecting your work at the UN?
Well, it's certainly, it's very disappointing to see the direction that this administration is going. Certainly, as they are in negotiations, they're promoting the same things that we oppose and certainly that the previous administration opposed. And so, one of the great achievements under the Trump administration was the Geneva Consensus Declaration, where the US and 30 some other countries all signed a document basically just stating the fact that there is no human right to abortion and, with some pro-family language. And this was a great thing. And now the US has basically stepped back from this. Now,
so Uncle Joe doesn't want to hear that, does he?
Unfortunately not.
Oh, you see that, folks? Look, elections have consequences. Elections have consequences. Be careful what you vote for. You might get your stimulus check, but you might lose your family. You might lose your own personal identity. The human race might be lost because of this. Hey, you've been a great guest. I hope we get a chance to see you again. In the meantime, folks, I'm for action, and I hope you are too. We would like to thank our generous sponsors for their wonderful support. Thanks for watching. Please join us next time for Action for Life. I'm for action, and I hope you are too. I'm Father Michael Orsi. I am your host for Action for Life Television, that good news program which talks about the gospel of Jesus Christ, the big G, and the little g, all the good things that people are doing to put the gospel of life into action. So please join us for the next episode of Action for Life.